Hello, everyone. This is Small Town Voice, Sophia. I am now in the metropolitan of Beijing, my hometown. It took me a few days to come here and get some rest, so now I'm back. There's just so many things going on. I got overwhelmed and can hardly follow. But today, I actually think that sometimes when there's a lot of things going on, step back and have a look at what happened in the past can help me to understand what is going on and also can more or less see what is coming. So let's have a look. Now, a couple weeks ago, I had an opportunity to be on the Duran and had a very interesting discussion with Alexander Mercurius and Alex Cristoforo. And in that conversation, I mentioned that I believe the United States has a enemy pipeline. More precisely, I think I should probably call it the target countries pipeline. In any event, there is some kind of pipeline that the United States, the deep state, and the neocons, they want to target a number of countries. They want all the countries in the world, all the governments in the world, pretty much follow the U.S. order. That's ultimately is the neocons' goal. Whichever country does not do that is going to be put in the pipeline. And specifically, we can have a look at what Wesley Clark, a former NATO commander, in one of his interviews, he talked about this. Here is what he said.
Right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went down right after 9/11, about 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who used to work for me, and one of the generals called me in. He said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." I said, "Is it classified?" He said, "Yes, sir." I said, "Well, don't show it to me." And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, "You remember that?" He said, "Sir, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you."
I'm sorry, what did you say his name was?
I'm not going to give you his name.
So go through the countries again.
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran. So when you look at Iran, you say, is it a replay? It's not exactly a replay, but here's the truth, that Iran from the beginning has seen that the presence of the United States in Iraq was a threat. A blessing, because we took out Saddam Hussein and the Baathists. They couldn't handle them. We took care of it for them. But also a threat because they knew that they were next on the hit list.
Now, according to him, this conversation happened before they started the war in Iraq, right? It was still a war on terror just started in Afghanistan, but they were already thinking about planning of having a war in Iraq. And according to him, the person told him it's not going to end in Iraq, it's going to be continued in Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and then finished in Iran. Well, subsequently, that's pretty much what happened, isn't it? In Iraq, 2003, Iraq was invaded and Saddam Hussein were killed. And followed in 2006 was the Lebanon War, and it has been on and off throughout the years. And in 2019, even though when Donald Trump first came to the office, he put a suspension on the fund on the military aid to Lebanon, but then he quickly released it again, and that was 105 million foreign military financing funds to Lebanese armed forces. So the U.S. has been participating one way or another in the Lebanon war. In 2009, Somalia's civil war broke, and in Somalia's case, U.S. involvement started in 2007, and between 2007 and 2020, the U.S. spent at least 2.5 billion on counterterrorism operations in Somalia. This is according to Cost of War, a 2023 Brown University study. So the U.S. has been active in the Somalia civil war. And then 2011 was the Libya civil war, where Muammar Gaddafi was killed, and Libya has been a failed state ever since. And in 2011, Syria's civil war is started, and until now it's still not fully finished, because 1/3 of Syria now is occupied by the US. In 2011, Sudan split into two countries as a result of the civil war, where the US played a key role in South Sudan's 2011 self-determination referendum and independence. The US has been involved in all these countries' civil wars, sometimes directly, like the invasion of Iraq and the bombing of Libya, sometimes indirectly, like providing funds for different military factions within the country, like in Lebanon. And as you can see, the US administration has been working on this pipeline, making progress throughout the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and also the Trump administration. Even though Trump is reluctant to start new wars in any country, but he did continue funding different military factions within the country, and he also assassinated Soleimani, who is a major general from Iran. So out of these 7 countries, that Syria and Iran are the countries that hasn't been totally obedient, which means the neocons, the deep state, will continue to find opportunity to work on those 2 countries. And look at what's going on now in Gaza. Part of the reason the US has been giving Israel unconditional support is because they see the opportunity to continue to work on those 2 countries and hopefully start a war with Iran. When I say hopefully, I mean from the neocons' perspective. And the reality is Israel has been bombing both Lebanon and Syria. It has already started, right? And US is closely watching the situation, and also looking for opportunity to start a war with Iran. That's pretty obvious. Now, people are saying the U.S. Always unconditionally supporting Israel is because the Israel lobby. Israel lobby is part of it. The other part of it is the neocons, the deep state. They wanted this conflict to continue and hopefully even intensify until Iran cannot stand by and just watching. That's what they want, because in the pipeline, Iran is there. There are also a few countries Wesley Clark has not mentioned, but they are nonetheless also, in my view, also in the pipeline. For example, Pakistan. In 2003, right after the United States invaded Iraq, there were drone attacks in certain parts of Pakistan. And last year, 2022, there are evidence showing that U.S. was involved in the removal of its Prime Minister Imran Khan. And then 2002, there is also a drone strike in Yemen. And of course, 2014 is where the civil war broke in Yemen. The Yemen civil war is still ongoing, extremely brutal, but U.S. also heavily involved in that war as well. Then, of course, 2014 is Ukraine had a coup, the Maidan coup, where its president, Viktor Yanukovych, was forced to flee the country, directly lead to today's Ukraine war. So these are the countries I would say also in the pipeline, has been dealt with. Now, how about China? China is definitely in the pipeline. And let's have a look at what happened recently to have an idea. October 7th is when Hamas attacked Israel. And shortly after that, Israel started bombing Gaza. And from the 7th until the 12th, there were discussions, there were phone calls amongst the United States, Israel, and Arab countries. But clearly, those phone calls didn't generate any result. And Blinken on October 13th went to Saudi, but MBS didn't show up, which tells us the previous days negotiations and discussions didn't go very well, to the degree that MBS even didn't want to see Blinken. So on the 14th noon, Blinken called Wang Yi. And on the 15th of October, Wang Yi then called the Saudi Foreign Minister Farhan al-Saud. The same day, Wang Yi also talked to the Turkey Foreign Minister and the Iranian Foreign Minister, I guess, to briefing them the latest, and also wanted to find out what is their plan, or they have any idea how to solve the conflict. Also the same day, October 15th, finally MBS met Blinken. And by all accounts, the discussion didn't go very well. Blinken only talked about to free the hostages, whereas MBS want a ceasefire, an immediate stop of the bombing. So they talked less than an hour. Same day, October 15th evening, Blinken went to Egypt and met Egyptian President al-Sisi. Al-Sisi agreed to let foreign nationals leave Gaza and humanitarian aid go into Gaza through the Egyptian border. Now, of course, all these were under the assumption that Israel would go along with what the United States promised. Then, the very next day, October 16th, Israel recanted what was promised and saying all the reports about partially open the border, etc., were not true, and they were ready for a ground operation. Then on October 17th, the U.S. Commerce Department issued more sanctions on Chinese high-tech companies, mainly in the semiconductor industry. On October 18th, Gaza hospitals were bombed, and in the afternoon, Biden was heading to Israel. Now, of course, after that is lots of drama, many resolutions happening in the United Nations, etc. But till then, you can see, even in the midst of the crisis going on in the Middle East, and the Blinken was asking Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister's help, to get a meeting with Saudi Prince MBS. Even so, the U.S. hasn't forgotten to sanction Chinese companies on October 17th, right? So the U.S. certainly hasn't slowed down its confrontation with China, certainly hasn't forgotten to continue its sanction, right, etc. So that's where China is, that U.S. ultimately still believe it needs to confront China. Now, regarding China, here is the issue. The Washington elites very much agree that they will eventually confront China, but they have not fully agreed on how to do that. There is a reluctance for United States to involve directly. Lloyd Austin said that, and Lindsey Graham also said that the people in Taiwan to fight until the last person in Taiwan. So direct involvement, it seems, is not preferred, but Taiwan is not a very good proxy, because even Taiwan's own constitution says Taiwan is part of China, and the U.S. own official policy is recognizing there's just one China and Taiwan is part of it. Also, when the mainland decided to unify Taiwan, the effort would be different. And even Putin at one point said that China doesn't need to use force to unify Taiwan. And Xi Jinping himself repeatedly said that Chinese doesn't kill Chinese. What they are referring to are blockade. Taiwan is an island, and a blockade would be very detrimental to Taiwan's economy, etc. So there are other ways than military action from the mainland. In other words, militarily, diplomatically, politically, Taiwan is not a very good proxy, because when you have a proxy war, you want this war to drag long, right? To keep on dragging and weakening China, that's a good proxy. Now, if China chose to use military means, and by all estimates, Taiwan won't last for 3 days, maybe a week. So militarily, politically, diplomatically, Taiwan is not very good proxy. Okay, so who else? Basically, any country who are bordering China, right? You can tell from their pushing. Now, the recent has been Philippines. You can see there's some conflicts that the U.S. has stirred up, and etc. And from time to time, you see U.S. is trying to push the Philippines to have some argument with China, and not to mention that U.S. is building 4 military bases now in the Philippines. I would say the the US probably doesn't have a fixed country in their mind. They are fishing. They're just looking. One day could be the Philippines. The next day could be Vietnam and Korea, certainly, etc. Just all the neighboring countries, including countries in this has dispute with China in the South China Sea. Any country could be a candidate. So what's next? Now, the ground war will continue in Gaza and possibly intensify. Netanyahu himself said it's going to be a long war. The US will continue to cover for Israel at the United Nations. In the meantime, the US will continue to sanction China, suffocate China in trade, commerce, technology, etc., sell weapons to Taiwan, and at the same time, continue to stir troubles between China and all its neighbors, including the South China Sea neighbors. The goal is simply to find a proxy. Now, if they can't find one, then Taiwan is always there being the backup, right? In short, the target pipelines is there. It is growing and moving forward. We're not going to see peace in real time soon. I want to finish today's program with a clip of an interview conducted by Paul Ray, Real News senior editor. He interviewed Zbigniew Brzezinski in 2010, 13 years ago. They talked a whole range of things. The interview had 3 parts. I only find 2, and I will put the links in the description box. I find this part where he talked about a war with Iran particularly interesting.
In 1979, when the Iranian Revolution overthrew the American allied Shah, Zbigniew Brzezinski was National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. 30 years later, Iran's still a central challenge facing U.S. geopolitical strategy. In the third segment of my interview with Dr. Brzezinski, I asked him about Israel's threat to bomb Iranian nuclear facilities and the American strategy towards Iran. I started by asking Dr. Brzezinski about an interview he gave last September to the website The Daily Beast. In that interview, Dr. Brzezinski was asked, how aggressive can Obama be in insisting to the Israelis that a military strike might be in America's worst interest? Brzezinski answered, we're not exactly impotent little babies. They have to fly over our airspace in Iraq. Are we just going to sit there and watch? He was then asked, what if they fly over anyway? Well, we have to be serious about denying them that right. That means a denial where you aren't just saying it. If they fly over, you go up and you confront them. They have the choice of turning back or not. I sat down with Dr. Brzezinski at the Center for Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., where he's a counselor and trustee. Talk about American strategy towards Iran. It's fairly well known. You had a bit of a falling out with President Obama on this. You were talking about opposing any potential Israeli attack on Iran. I mean, you weren't the only one.
No, I wasn't saying opposing. I was saying that we should not let them use our airspace without our permission, because no matter what, we would be held as complicit and we would be paying the price for it. So if our view is that this is not desirable, we should not allow our airspace to be used. If we want it to be used, fine, but let's be clear about it. It's not a good idea to stumble into a war regarding which you're ambivalent. That has to be made, that decision has to be made with open eyes. But my view on Iran is that we have to be patient and that deterrence can work. We don't need to increase the scale of the conflict in the region that we have been discussing, because an increase in that conflict involving the Iranians in a collision with us would make our task in Afghanistan absolutely impossible, would probably reignite the conflict in Iraq, would set the Persian Gulf ablaze, would increase the price of oil twofold, threefold, fourfold, and Americans would be paying $5, $6 a gallon at the gas stations. Europe would become even more dependent on the Soviet Union for energy. So what is the benefit to us?
The people advocating this more militaristic approach, I have to ask, do you think they mean it, or is this good cop, bad cop?
I'm not a mind reader.
It seems that the Pandora's box this would open boggles the mind.
I would think any reasonable person would conclude that, and I think the United States is not in favor of a war. That's why we're doing what we can in Geneva.
Is Israel serious in these threats?
I have no idea. I have no idea. All I know is, as an analyst of international politics, that this will be a disaster. And frankly, I think it'll be a disaster for us more than for Israel. More than for Israel. In the short run, and a fundamental disaster for Israel in the long run. Because if the consequence of that is that in the end we're forced out of the region, as we might be, because of almost sort of dynamic hatred that develops, and have no illusions about it, that the conflict spreads, we're going to be alone. The Russians are not going to be with us. They're not suckers. The Europeans are not going to be with us. They don't like to be in the forefront of conflict for historic reasons. We are going to be engaged. And if we are finally driven out, how much would you bet on the survival of Israel for more than 5 to 10 years after all that has happened? So, you know, some people who criticize me for being straightforward on this think this is an anti-Israeli point of view. You know, they're entitled to their demagogy. But my view is it will be a geopolitical disaster for us in the short run, and it's to the extent that Israelis are concerned about it for themselves.
The pressure that's being put on Iran is pushing Iran closer to Russia and China.
No, it's not pushing them close to Russia or China. We're pushing the Chinese and the Russians to engage in a more direct conflict with the Iranians, but they're reluctant because they have a different view of the situation. And in a different way, each has different interests.
But Russia and China are both getting much more involved in the Iranian economy. The Iran comes in Shanghai Cooperation Agreement meetings. No. Wait a second.
The Chinese are getting more involved in Iranian economy because they need energy. And they're not going to be particularly grateful if we produce a conflict in the region. And that will also affect them. And what consequences that might have for the world economy is hard to predict. All I'm saying is, don't trifle with this silly notion, oh, we'll just bomb them and the problem is solved. It's a false analogy, and historically, there's one fundamental lesson we shouldn't forget. Stalin and the Soviet Union was more of a threat than Iran ever will be, and yet we deterred it. Mao Zedong talked of a nuclear war which might kill 300 million people, and so what? And we didn't have a war with the Chinese. Why should we act like crazies in dealing with Iran?
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
That's all for now. If you like my program, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you.